What crazy and weird stories do you need to tell? Episode 8. I worked at a Greyhound bus station when I was 16. I had a guy come in to wait on a bus. He came up to the counter and struck up a conversation with me. He said he was from California and that God had come to him in a dream and told him to move to Tennessee and open a used car lot. I said cool and got back to my paperwork. He then proceeded to ask if I would marry him and open this business with him. I declined. Pointed out that I'm only 16 and nope. He went back and sat down. A few minutes later, he came back and sat a quarter down on my counter and said, how about this? We'll flip for it. Heads, you marry me. Tails, we drop it. I told him to take the quarter over to the payphone and call my dad. If my dad says it's completely fine to marry a complete stranger from a Greyhound bus station with a holy mission to open a used car lot, I will absolutely marry him. He didn't make the call. LOL. I was working at a university family medicine clinic. I was upstairs in my boss's office talking to a coworker who was Muslim and I at the time was a devout Catholic. I only mention this to point out that we have different religious beliefs and backgrounds. We are standing maybe 2.5 feet away facing each other. All of a sudden this huge ball of bright light appeared between us. It was nearly blinding. It was there for at least a good minute and then disappeared. We both looked at each other and said, "Did you just see that?" It was crazy. It wasn't storming out that day, and when this happened a patient in the clinic below us died. That was over 25 years ago. I'll never ever forget it. While on spring break in my senior year of high school, my friends and I stole a total of 96 12-ounce beers from several gas stations by simply grabbing a few cases, running out the front door with them and driving away. We ended up going 3 for 5 on attempts, and the last one resulted in an intense semi-chase where my friend pulled some evasive maneuvers in a Mercury Grand Marquis to get away from a local citizen that tried to stop us. 2 of my friends were so spooked they went home early that week, but ultimately we got away with it. Really lucky not to get shot at, or at least do serious jail time since I was 18 at the time. About 5 years ago or so my friend drags me out for Wind Down Wednesday. I'm outside smoking a cigarette when someone asked me for a lighter. I start to smell the familiar odor of weed and I look to my left and it's one of the players on our local NBA team. I proceed to spark up a conversation and share his blunt and then we end up hanging out with him, bottle service shots, all sorts of crazy stuff. I decided to call it a little early again because it was a Wednesday, so I left earlier than everyone else. As I drove home, yeah, I know, terrible pre-Uber days, I had my window down smoking a cigarette when I hear a woman screams. I look to my left and see a man on top of a woman and in my inebriated stupor I yell out, "Are you okay?" She says no, so me and the car behind me pull over and proceed to kick the shit out of this guy. He was a squirrely crackhead and managed to slip away. The 2 guys ran after him and I stayed with the girl. One of the guys, I see him slip in a field and when he comes back his whole back is covered in. Police officers show up of around 25 minutes later and I'm pretty hammered still, so I immediately take off. Crazy night. I drop off and pick up my fiancée from work every day. She works as a DSP, works with adults with disabilities in their house, and I legally can't know where they live, so I'm required to park a few houses down. Now, the way that the car park and house are set up, I pretty much park in the same spot every day. I was dropping her off in the middle of the day and a woman came out of the house I park in front of and tried to get in our car. We asked her WTF she was doing and said she was waiting for someone, but when I was leaving she was walking away through the neighborhood, so clearly not waiting for someone. It was weird, but whatever. Fast forward a week to last night, 10 p.m. 3 people come out of the same house and try to get in my car. I pull forward and get out of the car and basically say, "FT, this is the second time you've tried to get in my car." They start yelling at me that they're waiting for someone, clearly waiting on drugs, and I'm telling you can't just climb into people's car, there's no Uber sign and I'm not your drug dealer. The guy with her was yelling and telling me that I won't get anywhere with my attitude and to go away, they were waiting for someone. So, yes, looking forward to parking there every day. So, I used to live in the hood in my mid-20s and this man named Carlos started hanging around me. Carlos was a low-level MS-13 coke dealer. For some reason he took a shine to me and was always bringing over drugs. He was the type of guy to bring a blunt over to smoke and not tell you it had crack in it. Well, I'd sold drugs exceedingly small time and the two of us decided I should get back into it, so I started trying to sell coke with him. I quickly found out that lots of PPL really wanted meth, so I inquired about purchasing some. I was told that I'd have to work my way up to get in contact with the good plugs. Being young and invincible, I said okay. The work I had to do was to go along on deals and basically just have a gun and be prepared to use it should the need arise. I did so. After a while I got introduced to the higher-up dudes who were scary. Then one day I'm riding in a SUV with 3 gangbangers who all have full prison face tattoos and I have a gun and several ounces of meth on me, and it clicked how recklessly I was living. I gave up and never went back. I didn't even get rich dealing since I had an opiate habit. Young me was stupid. I'm lucky I didn't kill someone. It was funny though, living in a Mexican neighborhood and everyone respected me like I was George Young. Gods, I was dumb then. I think I got the idea from my grandfather who'd been a legit drug trafficker in the 70s, 80s and 90s until he was in trouble with like 900 pounds of weed in Texas. Crazy times. In the mid-80s I went to a small Catholic school for 7th and 8th grade, in an attempt to improve my studies as I was an extremely poor student. The class size was really small, like 12 of us 8th graders, total. Then we moved and I transferred to a larger school for my first year, where there were 1,200 students, and I was absolutely terrified of the move and the new school. A couple of months before my friend, from my last school, had gone to Mexico with his grandfather and smuggled back a bunch of switchblades. He was our hero. He allowed me and our other best friend to pick whichever one we wanted, and I ended up with a stiletto, blade springs out of one end, with an owl's head on it. I loved this blade, sharpening it on my stepdad's whetstone, and keeping it oiled up with WD-40. I stored it in one of those Crown Royal velvet bags. First day of school I'm freaked out and scared, all sweaty and gripping that stiletto in my hand. As I bumped through the crowded halls, I smacked into this smaller kid, also a first-year student, and snicked. I bumped the button and inadvertently stabbed him in the upper arm. A line of blood instantly ran down his arm, as I looked into his huge, terrified eyes. Like an owl. I coughed I'm sorry and ran off, hiding the switchblade in my locker, certain that the principal, or police, was going to get me. But the strangest thing, nothing happened. The kid didn't rat on me, and apparently didn't tell anyone, poor guy. For the rest of high school, he avoided me like the plague, and we never had another interaction. I should have apologized to him, at some point, but I was embarrassed about stabbing him. Today, there'd be a school lockdown, and I'd probably be shot by a SWAT team or something. I ate a pretzel crisp on Friday and swallowed it sooner than I should have because I was getting a work call. Turns out that can be an expensive pretzel/phone call. The pretzel cut a hole in my esophagus. I was in a lot of pain, and I thought I had it stuck in my throat, so I drank a LaCroix. Turns out that made it much worse. I got a buildup of air in my chest cavity that found its way behind my heart, into my back, and behind my entire throat. The air behind my throat distorted my voice, which caused me to freak and go to the ER. Turns out I was in a life-threatening condition due to possible heart failure from the air behind my heart and sepsis from bacteria where it shouldn't be. I was admitted to the ICU for 3 days until I told them I was done laying in a bed. The doctors think I will be fine now but aren't 100% because I left the hospital with abnormally low blood pressure. In 2014, I was working for a radio station as their music director, and I got sent to a conference entitled CMJ. Our radio station got nominated and we thought it'd be a good networking opportunity. It was my first work trip, first trip traveling alone and first time going to NYC. I fly into the airport and get in line for the yellow taxi. I was nervous coming in as there were a bunch of people with medical masks on. This was during the Ebola outbreak, and I was tired from a long flight. After standing in line for a yellow cab for about an hour with no movement, I was eager to just get to the hotel. Then, this Indian guy in a black leather jacket walks up to me and asks if I need a taxi, and I say yes without thinking and start walking with him to his car in the parking lot, keeping in mind he was asking everyone in line who was turning him down. We reach the edge of the lot, and he unlocks a black unmarked van. I immediately regretted my decision. He starts the car and says to wait while he pays for parking and leaves me. I sit in the black van wondering if I should get my luggage and get back in line and how awkward that would be for a few minutes, but right before I decide to leave he gets in the drive seat and whispers to me, "Pretend to be my friend." A woman in her late 20s/mid-30s then enters the van. I have no idea what took over me, but I just go along with it. Through the idle chat I figured that we're dropping her off first. The driving was stereotypical for what I thought of an NYC cab driver, fast and furious. For some reason, however, the woman is extremely interested in me/my legitimacy. This guy says you're his friend. Yep. Where did you meet? He actually picked me up in a taxi a few weeks ago and we've been friends since. Where do you live in NYC? Brooklyn. Me too. Where? South Brooklyn. These are direct quotes. Whether she believes me or not, she goes along with it and starts talking our ears off. I found out that she is Jane Lynch's talent agent and she's married to a very tall/handsome ski instructor from Europe. We drop her off and the driver bursts out laughing, surprised that I went along with this at all. Apparently, he did not want her to split the fare with me for the ride, so hoped that I would just go along with this plan, which I did for some reason. The driver ended up being super nice. He proceeded to tell me his history being from Bombay and living in NYC for the last decade driving around. He gives me a tour around Brooklyn and shows me where Nas lived during the recording Illmatic. He buys me dinner at an excellent restaurant called Aladdin and we watch two women fight in the street. We pick up his cousin and his laundry and smoke some weed and drive around listening to wild Middle Eastern/Indian sounding electronic music. We then stopped by some auto shop where he speaks rapid/angry Hindi to a guy there. Apparently he convinced the guy he was selling his van to me because he owed him money, which I didn't know until after we drove away. He then drops me off at my hotel for free. On the very first day of the conference, I went to a bowling alley sponsored for the event and almost got Ebola. Best first day in NYC/cab ride I've ever had. Okay, so the obvious thing to ask is, well, does he look like him? And the answer is, sort of. Here's kind of a silly transition picture I see people use a lot with my grandpa in it. It would be easy to compare the two with a picture of my grandpa at Jim Morrison's age. However, there are no pictures of my grandpa between 12 to 40. This could be for two reasons: he's Jim Morrison, or it's because his family was in a Catholic cult. This leads to another issue. My grandpa was abused as a child and went in this cult. Not only that, but he is an avid drug user. So, he has dissociative identity disorder. Which means one of his personalities is Jim Morrison. Obviously, this leads to the issue of just asking, so are you? 'Cause he says yes, but whether it's because of his disorder or because he really is? Not sure. It's easy now to write off this theory as just my grandpa's disorder or drug history, but there is still a lot of really strange evidence. If I can write it all down for you guys right now, but I'm happy to answer questions. For instance, he has Pam tattooed on his arm. He has lots of tattoos, and it's been there since before my mom was born and before any of her siblings were born. If you ask him about it, he'll tell you about his first girlfriend, who he was madly in love with, but also fought with a lot. He's very secretive about it, but he tells me he loved her quite a bit. Another short one is my grandpa knows Stephen King. My mom remembers sitting on his lap and him buying them food. He called her Goldilocks. This is funny because King claims to have seen Jim Morrison and is also an avid believer that Jim Morrison is still alive. There is more to the story, but I'll just answer questions. Not my story, it is my grandmother's and her sister's story, my grandfather's and mom's too. The sisters would laugh about it until they all passed away. When they were all young in the 1940s in this tiny, small town now swallowed up by the Mississippi River, they went on basically a short road trip down to New Orleans one Mardi Gras and flirted with all the sailors. My grandmother met herself a rather handsome one who bought all the sisters lots of drinks, and they danced and partied hard till the eldest sister realized it was time they had to head back home, or they would get in trouble. The young sailor offered to drive them home since they were all way too drunk to drive even by 1940s standards. However, he didn't know the roads and took one turn a little too sharp and rolled the car and it landed upside down in the swamp, but my grandmother and my great-aunts who were still drinking managed to come out unscathed and even managed not to spill the whiskey. Because of the wreck, the young sailor got into trouble for a bit and missed going to Hawaii with his peers, possibly missing more problem to his people weren't still in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor was hit. However, he was in trouble in Louisiana. He and my grandmother got married that Easter and my mom was a little early. The way my one great aunt said it was noticeably clear she was on time just as the wedding was late. I have always loved running long distances. I grew up on a large cattle ranch, and after helping mom unload groceries I would change clothes and take off on a run down the dirt roads. I would try to get all the way to the creek and back before dark. One male Great Pyrenees named Lobo would usually come along and flank me, or scout ahead and circle back to me, etc. We would often stop and walk, explore stuff, climb trees, or jump in a tank if it were hot. The feeling of running at a steady pace, charging up a hill and then letting loose down the other side, letting my brain turn off was fantastic. And the smells, caliche, mesquite, cottonwood in the low wet places. When I was in middle school I started running track, and I was getting big enough to cover more distance. I found tons of cool places, fossils, and arrowheads that you never would see if you just drove around on a four-wheeler. One evening I was really feeling ready to cover some ground, but the dog was not so interested. I took off towards the creek and made it all the way just as the sun went down. I splashed some water on my arms and face, congratulated myself, and turned east toward the house as the light faded and the heat with it. Crickets come out to sing with the frogs. It was a bit cold, and I didn't bring a light, but I wasn't worried. I was not a fearful child. Until I start hearing cracking grass and sticks, along with the shuffle of four-legged creatures behind and to the side of me. The cattle were not in that pasture, plus the sounds they make are different. Sometimes quail would startle out of the grass as I ran by, but nothing was flying out and whatever it was gaining on me. Then I hear more noise to my left and realize there's multiple animals. There were no witnesses so I have no idea what my actual speed was, but I can tell you that my body did not and probably will never move that fast again. My heart and lungs were bursting but I just kept sprinting towards the house. I flew home and as I did the Pyrenees, we usually had 3 or 4, sprinted out and passed me in the opposite direction. There was a lot of barking that night. Turns out, Lobo didn't want to run that day because he had been chasing coyotes away from the house pasture all night. He was a genuinely great dog, and that's the story of my best run ever. I was an in-house photographer for a local up-and-coming rap studio. I was used to seeing loads of cash, big guns, and tons of drugs but I turned a blind eye and minded my business. One day I was in a small studio room taking photos of a rapper and his large posse when the door flung open and a regular I've seen many times starts beating the hell out of the guy rapping in the booth. I immediately put the camera away and stand still as they pull him off the poor guy. He sat there dripping blood and collecting his thoughts as his attacker grabbed a seat and apologized to us profusely and explained it was over Twitter beef before leaving for a bit. Everything calms down for a bit and the guy is still bleeding. Next thing I know the door flies open and it's the guy again as if he had forgotten that he already beat the hell out this guy. This time though he comes in on the phone talking really loudly and telling the bloody guy how he's putting a hit out on him and his whole team and if they try leave he will shoot them himself. Pistol tucked in his waist, I stood there and was convinced I was going to have to help dispose of the body or he was going to take me out as well. The owner of the studio calms him down and eventually tells him to leave and cool down. Jail's not worth it, etc. At this point most of the posse has up and left, leaving just Bloody Guy, his go-to person, and a girl in the studio as they finish their time they booked. No refund policy once started. An hour goes by, and Bloody Guy hasn't said much when the door flies open again. This time it's a girl who immediately pounces on the girl, who we then find out is the side chick and is there with Crazy Girls Man. She starts grabbing her by the hair and they go at it. We separate them and kick the entire group out of the studio, which was located in an office building, because at this point they're becoming a liability. We are cleaning up the pile of fake hair, and who knows what that was left behind when we look on the security camera outside the main door and see the girl fighting the guy in the hallway, so we run outside to stop it because they are still the responsibility of the studio owner. It's at this point that she loses every marble in her brain and reaches in his sweatpants and grabs him by the dick, trying to pull it off as she leads him outside to the car. The last thing we saw was him crying and screaming, "She's got my dick," as he left. I've never been so scared in a single night, and I've also never laughed so hard in a single night. Roller coaster of emotions. I've never told a soul about that night until now. My sister and her friend in university were out one night, and it was a fancy dress-themed night out. They, and other friends, had gone dressed as aliens, so green clothes, cute antennas, and so on. My sister's friend at some point decides to go home, and as their flat was walking distance, she walks. On the way back to their flat, there's a bridge. My sister's friend notices a man standing on the bridge, attempting to commit suicide, and she tries talking him down and calls for help, and she succeeded in helping him, and she continues home after help arrived. Fast forward to the next morning, she or one of her friends, I can't remember, were on social media and noticed a post or article about the person who had attempted to throw himself off the bridge. The man who's attempting suicide had been on some drugs or something, because he genuinely believed that she was an alien that had been sent to stop him from killing himself, and that's why he didn't do it. About a year ago I was at my house, and I heard some commotion at the house next door. They usually have parties, so I thought nothing of it. But then I heard a scream from a woman yelling, "You broke her jaw," as well as other things. So, I walk outside to my backyard to hear it better, but I couldn't. Then I just went back inside, but a bit of time passes, and I hear more things, and I hear "walk to," the sound of my voice. And after a couple seconds get in the F***King CR, and I walk back inside and look out the window in the living room, and I see a police officer a couple inches away from my face with an assault rifle pointing at the other house, using my truck as cover. Then I look out the other window and see another police officer using the tree in the front yard as cover with another assault rifle, and I also see the two people who started this, a man and a woman, both with guns, with a police car in the street, who were close to being arrested. Really nothing else happened during that. Luckily the people didn't kill anyone, but it did seem like they might. But in the morning the light in the front yard on the wall was off, even though it should be on. Then I realized a police officer must have unscrewed the bulb to turn it off. Middle school, 8th grade year. These pain-in-the-ass girls were kneeing my back during an assembly. They kept insulting me and my friend. They kept insulting me and him, calling me a fat person and other way more rude things that I'll just leave out. They were distracting to the point that we didn't hear POF get called for his 4.14 GPA, or me get called for my 3.86. Now, like any regular person, I was not happy. I then intentionally put my backpack on as the ultimate petty move. Let me say that made them angry. They started cussing me out in Spanish, I assume anyways, as we live in California, and calling me, shockingly, even worse names. Who could believe it? I then turned straight around and said something along the lines of, "Shut your Pentagon ass looking head up." Let me just say that ended it all. I kid you not, their heads looked like a literal pentagon. Kind of a small world story. I grew up in Central NJ. I met this Egyptian kid who lived down the street in 2nd grade, and we were pretty much best friends until he moved to Qatar in 4th or 5th grade. Fast forward to me going to college in Colorado. My sophomore year I'd become friends with a kid who was originally from Oklahoma but spent most of his life overseas. Most recently he lived in Tokyo before moving back to the States. One time we were all partying and telling stories and it came up that the first time he ever saw porn was when he briefly lived in Qatar and some funny Egyptian kid from New Jersey who became my best friend pulled porn up on the computer at school. Turns out it was the same kid who lived on my street in NJ like almost 10 years earlier. Crazy. I was with a high school friend who had never been to California, and I hadn't seen him in over like 15 years. We were riding in my Jeep with no top on and checking out the sights around Magoo Park. We came up one turn and what I thought was a couple was sitting in lawn chairs, watching the waves from atop this mountain. They had a motorcycle with them, and I just made mention, oh, that's a cool idea. Watch some waves from a great view with your bike. When we passed them, they waved very enthusiastically at us, and we waved back. Thought it was strange how excited they were, but whatever, wonderful day, nice people I guess. We got to an area where it just kind of leads to a small neighborhood of extremely nice houses, so I just decided to turn around. I was trying to cram as much of Southern California scenery in for my friend as he hadn't seen it before. When we turned around, I decided to stop where the people had waved to us. We stopped and I realized it was a man and probably his son. His son was very stunted in height and had some sort of mental and physical disorder, I'm guessing Down syndrome but I'm not really sure. His dad was a stereotypical grizzled-looking motorcyclist. He was wearing whatever club he was in leather jacket and had a long goatee. His son started to wave at us like crazy and his dad yelled he loves Jeeps. So, I just yelled back, he can come check it out. So, he gathered up his son who was overly excited to see it up close. I told him if his son wants to hop in the driver's seat, go ahead. I helped him hop in and he was just enjoying being in it and pretending he could drive. He could verbally communicate but not much. His dad would translate to me whenever I had a tough time understanding him. The man was like, thanks man, I appreciate it. He loves Jeeps. He asked me what we were doing, and I explained that my friend was visiting who I hadn't seen in 15 years. He noticed some of my decals on the Jeep and was like, military? Yeah, medically retired Army. Job? Infantry. He grabbed up his other jacket from his bike and showed me his Semper Fidelis and told me he was a Vietnam veteran and retired federal employee. I told him I was currently being hired to be federal too. He congratulated me and we both thanked each other for our respective services. He asked me if I wanted a beer and I politely declined as I was driving. My friend took one though. He just started talking and told me his son was terminal and it would be very soon when he passes. He had already died apparently but was brought back in some miracle fashion by doctors. Was hospitalized for a ridiculous amount of time. He mentioned his other son was in the army and how much his son that was with him loved seeing him in uniform. He just wanted to take his son on one passing journey on his bike and soak in moments with him. We talked for a bit, military stuff mostly. My friend just stood by the side, taking pics of the ocean. It was kind of a strange moment to be in. I was just a blip of this guy's final days with his kid. We shook hands and I got back in my Jeep with my friend. As we drove off, we waved to them again. I guess it's not really that crazy of a story. To me, it was simply crazy because it put things in perspective. I just happened to come across a man who was spending decisive moments with his kid, who knows how much he had left. It was obvious he loved him dearly and was going to miss him when he was gone. I told my friend that I was really happy that he could have a moment with his kid and just him getting excited to see a Jeep was cool too. It's not like a rare car or anything but apparently he loves them and mine was his favorite color. I just got the Jeep the week prior. I have lots of crazy stories to share in my life. I usually share some of Askreddit whenever it seems fitting. That story was just unique to me, as I always look back and hope he and his son enjoyed their ride together. I'm sure they did. The time my entire family abandoned me during a nuclear attack. I was 14 and we had just moved to another province and were living with my grandparents for a few months until my mom could get a job and a place for my sister and I to live. The three of us were sharing a small bedroom basement. My sister and I had just started at a new school. This was about 1982 to 83 and nuclear war was an important thing. That week at my new school, we were studying the effects of it. In fact, on my first day there we had to sit for an hour and listen to this really horrible recording of all of the things that will happen to you in a nuclear war. I remember not knowing anyone and feeling really anxious and shy, and this man's voice was describing how your entire body would look like one big bruise, your hair and teeth would fall out and you'd have non-stop diarrhea. It was really traumatizing for me. One night that weekend, I had a bad dream. In it, a nuclear war had started. My grandparents were packing the trailer for us to escape. My mom kept trying to wake up my sister and I, but we wouldn't wake up. Finally, she got angry and dragged my sister out of bed but left me behind. I then woke up to an empty room. Normally, my sister and my mom would still be asleep on a Saturday morning. I was more of an early riser. I went upstairs and found the house empty. There was no sign that anyone had had coffee or any kind of breakfast. Usually on a weekend morning, my grandma would be baking, there'd be coffee on and breakfast. My grandpa would be sitting at the kitchen table, pretty much that household would be busy and talking. Then, I remembered my dream. I looked out the kitchen window. My grandpa's car and trailer were gone. I ran out the front door into the street. The sky was an alarming pink color. Everything looked empty and abandoned. Then the entire city had been evacuated and I was left behind. I can't even begin to describe the feeling of betrayal and abandonment I felt. I was my grandma's favorite grandchild. I got along better with my mom than my sister did. The thought that they would just leave me because I didn't wake up was appalling. Then I looked down and saw the bruise on my knee. It was already happening. I went weird stuff running around my grandparents' house, bawling and screaming. I remember my heart was pounding and I was so hot and sweaty. It took me a good 10 minutes to remember that my family had all gone on a late fall berry picking trip and I had stayed behind because I'd made a new friend and was going to do something with her. It was years before I told anyone about that morning. Just a preface for this. The year was 1997, so I was 8 years old, either in the 3rd grade or 4th, and was about 18 miles away from a city called Beaumont. If you were near that area at the time, then you probably heard of the kid Anthony Martinez that was abducted and later found dead. My parents and everyone else's parents included were on high alert and we were urged not to go anywhere unattended. I remember watching the news and seeing his picture, and it made me so sad since at the time he was only about 2 years older than me. Okay, so here's the actual story. We were in school and we were all at lunch and a friend and I were just walking the grass at our school. Now you have to know that our field was huge and it made an L where the smaller portion was somewhat hidden behind a fence that led to the janitor's area and a back entrance to our school. At that time there wasn't a fence or gate that really blocked it, so if no one were looking you could definitely get in. My friend and I, naturally he was the troublemaker, wanted us to explore that area since no one had really done it before, so right when the bell rang everyone was walking to their rooms and Robert and I snuck towards that empty part behind the fence. We were giggling and so curious, but we suddenly stopped dead in our tracks. About maybe 20 feet away we saw a man who was smiling, pretending to fix the sprinklers, and we shouted, "Who are you?" He didn't say much but was still just smiling creepily at us and waved for us to come over. We did not go over and I told Robert let's go because I was not comfortable. He then started swinging and spinning his arms as if he was dancing. I still remember clearly what he was wearing because it never left my mind. He had a thicker mustache, looked kind of tall and somewhat thin, and was white, and he was wearing a white Mickey Mouse t-shirt and some blue jeans and wore a hat. When we both had seen that, we both looked at each other and looked kind of confused because we'd never seen grown man wear something like that before. We then asked him why he was wearing that Mickey Mouse t-shirt, and still no word from him, just waved for us to come over. At that moment I said to Robert, let's run and leave, so we both turned around and ran as fast as we could to class. I've honestly never been so scared in my life and never even looked back. We went straight to class and told our teacher what had happened, and all she said was, "Boys, you shouldn't lie like that ever again," and we were so stunned at that answer. Till this day I have no idea who that man was. If he was a janitor of some kind, he was really not doing his job right at all, and if he was something else, then he definitely played that part perfectly. When I was 6 or 7. My stepfather and I were driving through a desert part of Texas. Barish, the border, I presume. It was about a 100-mile offshoot road that was state-owned and seemingly very seldom took. We traveled a lot and enjoyed taking these side adventures whenever we could. After going for 40 or 50 miles in the easily 100+ temp, I was getting bored looking out the window, seeing nothing but rolling desert and those wavy heat lines on the horizon, and I was starting to nod off. All of a sudden I see a glimmer about a mile or so away off in the distance. I told my dad and he laughed. Blah blah mirage blah, and we continue on. Sure enough, after 30 seconds I see it again. This time so does he. We stop. But don't get out of the truck. As a minute or two goes by, we make out a human emerging from this god-awful desert, half crawling, half running, waving her hands at us. We make out it's an older lady eventually and hop out the truck. Exasperated, she says her bus broke down. She's a professor with 8 students searching for fossils, and she's been out there with no water for 4 or 5 days. They had seen one vehicle at the time and had given up hope. They piled in the bed of the truck, and we took them to the nearest water/town. This was 93-ish, so no cell phones, etc. I had gotten out of class and headed to work early because if I went home it would already be time for me to leave for work again. I park in the parking lot and pull out my phone and begin to watch Netflix. Time passes, cars go in and out of the lot, and eventually a white car makes its way into the space next to mine. I look over, a girl steps out of the car and a man stays in the passenger seat. I don't think much of it and continue watching Netflix. Not 45 minutes later I look over to see the car still there with the man still in the car's passenger seat. A police car pulls up and begins trying to get the man's attention. Starts by knocking on the window and eventually opens the passenger door, and the guy topples out of the car. At this point, I hop out of my car and let the officer know that I am going to get out of his way so he can do whatever he needs to do. I walk over and talk to my coworkers and smoke a cigarette. I walk back over and see what's going on. The guy's face and lips are blue, and when the paramedic opens the guy's eyes, they are dried out and red. Anyway, after everything is said and done, I go into work my shift and I get a call from a coworker who works night shifts that lives right across the street saying some lady is messing with the car. I take a walk outside and ask if I can help her with anything. She gruffly says no. I explain what happened, and at this point, she is opening the trunk and packing bags. She tells me she was the one who was with the guy and the one who called it in. So noble, I know, leaving a guy ODing in a car while you run away with the drugs and hide while you call the cops instead of the medics because you obviously already know what is happening. She then proceeds to tell me it is none of my business and to leave her alone. Setting, late 80s at a state-run university on the East Coast. Over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, we had someone calling up the front desk of our dorm about 1 to 3 o'clock in the morning saying there is a bomb in the building. Everyone is evacuated, while the public safety department and police check the building. One night I was hanging out with my girlfriend in her different dorm. At the end of my visit we stepped out of the elevator into the lobby and there was a public safety officer with a clipboard looking at my direction. He turns to me, glances at his clipboard and says, "My full name, sir. You are instructed to follow me to the public safety office. There is something we need to discuss." Off we go to the public safety office. They lead me to a room, which I sit for about an hour when the head of public safety and a town police officer enter. Sir, you are aware of the number of bomb threats that are happening in your dorm. Well, all of the most recent threats came from your room's phone. Just let us know, were you aware of this happening? My roommate was big into rugby, and as all the rugby players do after each game/practice is drink heavily. As you could guess, he was getting back to our room that late, calling up the front desk to get the building to evac because of one reason that he admitted to. I wanted to see all of the hot chicks without their makeup. Perma banned from all the state-run schools, several hundred hours of community service, not sure if he served time or pay a fine, never heard from him again. This account starts with a dream, and then becomes a harrowing reality. I collect crystals and gems. I mostly only keep them for looking at now, but I used to take great care to cleanse them and neutralize them and all of that, nonsense to you or not. So, the majority of my rocks have been cleansed, but one day I received a large amethyst from my brother. He'd gotten it from a festival somewhere, and I wanted to cleanse it before I joined it with my other rocks, just to be safe. It's sort of a ritualistic habit, a superstition of mine, I'll just leave it at that. I set it on the floor next to the shelves that house the others. That night, I was distracted by a friend I had been staying the night with me. But the night after, I was alone, trying to sleep, and I could not get rid of this feeling that I was not actually alone, and that I was being watched. I just felt incredibly uneasy, could not calm my heart rate, could not relax. It was unlike any anxiety I can remember ever having before. I took a melatonin and finally started to fall asleep. I figured the drug would give me wonky dreams, as is common, and especially since I was in such an anxious state. I was right, but more than a dream, it was a lucid, sleep paralysis night terror. I was facing my bedroom wall, which I did purposefully, in case I got paralysis. I did this so as to not be able to look around my room and see anything I did not want to see. I could feel myself falling into sleep. I was still fully aware and felt the threshold of it, and as I began to give into it, the mouth of my lucid dream body shot open and this digitalized shriek came out of it. My teeth were born, and I was screaming through them. Once that subsided, I could hear a scuffling behind me, in the middle of my room as my back was facing it, and it was the sound of a small creature quickly moving toward me. I could hear that we were both breathing heavily. I told myself it was just a dream, and nothing could actually hurt me. I felt the thing's hands reach my back, but I just wiggled my toes, a technique that wakes me from sleep paralysis. When it finally worked, I was panting, of course. I laid there in the dark, and after a moment, I began hearing this clicking sound. I was trying to identify it, thinking maybe it was an empty water bottle popping. I don't have anything in my room that moves with the wind of the ceiling fan. The sound would occur once every 15 seconds or so. After a while, I turned on a light to try to identify it, in order to calm myself. In the light, I heard the sound 2 or 3 times, and then it stopped, of course, and I could not find anything in my room that could make that sound. I gave up, turned off the light, and got back into bed. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I went to work that morning, miserable of course. When I got home, I went to my room and sat on the floor to take care of the new crystal I'd received. That is when I noticed these claw marks, for lack of a better name. Something clicked in my mind, and I tried moving the rock about. Then, I identified the clicking sound. This was exactly the sound I had heard the night before. I took that rock and threw it in the ditch of a field around my house. I asked the authorities not to let anything follow me home, and thankfully, I haven't had any trouble since. I had a long-distance relationship with this guy from a faraway country. We were both exchange students from abroad for a brief period. So, the time came, we decided to continue the relationship even after we got back to our countries. Well, things are getting loosened as we live our lives. Kept in contact for a few years though, we slowly split away and broke up. I thought at least we could be friends for life. Then he stopped calling me and no answer to everything I tried contacted him. A few months before noticing that I lost contact with him, I had severe heart attack-ish experience. My heartbeat was abnormal, and I collapsed. However, I managed to stay awake. It was frightening. It was so strong I thought for the first time in my life that this is it, this is dying. Fast forward, about a year from the hard experience and lost contact, I received a FB message from a stranger. She wrote that she was a friend of my ex and would like to find this person he was fond of because she thinks it is courtesy to inform this person that he has passed away. At this point I was shocked and not shocked to be informed that the cause was cardiac failure. It could be just coincidence, but I would like to think this is a sign that we were soulmates. When I was in 6th grade, a new student came in and quickly proved to be an absolute psycho. This dude idolized the Columbine shooters, would talk about blowing up the school, drew graphic scenes of himself cutting off women's breasts and limbs, wrote about putting firecrackers into people's mouths, butts, and vaginas, tortured bugs by ripping them apart/stabbing them with unbent paper clips, and finally got expelled for bringing a massive Bowie knife and a fake pipe bomb to school. I searched for him on Facebook after going through some old yearbooks a couple of weeks ago. He's a police officer who posts white supremacist memes. This was a few years ago, but every time I see our stuff replacement car window I'm reminded of it. I don't know if old car, 90s Mazda Protege, windows are flimsier or what, but this blew my mind. It's summer like 14 and boyfriend and I are sitting in the dog park of our apt complex having a beer or two. Maybe like 2 inches. It borders a bunch of housing and neighborhoods, and it's not a super nice neighborhood. It's not uncommon to hear super loud house parties right next to the park, and it's that, as it's about midnight on a Saturday. We hear this girl scream. Like blood-curdling I am either being raped or murdered screams and a man yelling. No man, we hop in the car since this sounds about a block away and want to scope the address so we can call the police. Get a block near a cul-de-sac and this shirtless man comes booking it at our car. I scream, we stop, and this man launches himself using the fence for support at our back passenger window feet first. Shatters everywhere, thankfully no glass fallout on me. He gets on the back of the car and starts pounding on the back windshield and screaming, and my boyfriend just floors it, and he falls off. I just want to know how and how many drugs you have to be on to shatter a car window with tennis shoes on. We don't play Good Samaritan anymore. We did call the police officers and tell them the general area but never knew what happened. I still live in the same spot, but I keep my outside chilling to the balcony where if I hear anything I know the area to give to police officers. This year for my birthday, my husband took me along with some family members to see the redwoods in Humboldt County, CA. We stayed in a lovely VRBO he found located in a very, very small town, some 300 people. After a long morning of adventuring, we were returning to the house for lunch when we saw this awful mess of a house. Imagine your stereotypical, white trash, meth head house with a kiddie pool on the roof. The house itself was behind a chain link fence with so much trash piled up behind it you could barely see the house. There was smoke billowing from behind the fence. Almost everyone in the car dismissed it as a trash fire, except my husband who insisted something was wrong. He flipped a U and pulled over on the side of the road opposite the house. Sure enough, there were flames coming out of the roof. My sister-in-law calls 911, my husband runs to warn the neighbors, while my brother and I run to a nearby field where we see a farmer riding a tractor. He is completely oblivious to the fire, and it was quite difficult to even get his attention. We point out there is a fire, to which he responds Sure as we ask if he knows who lives there, he says he doesn't. So, from here I begin running around the perimeter of the house trying to look into the house for anyone trapped and listen for anyone calling for help. As I round the corner of the property I hear sitcom laughter coming from a shed. I scream, hello, is anyone there? Sure enough, a dazed, drugged-up looking man pokes his head out from the shed and simply says, what? I respond, your house is on fire. This time, with a bit more concern, what? I repeat, fire, 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 while pointing frantically. Aw shit. The man then grabs a garden hose and climbs onto the roof of the house. By this point the neighbors have gathered across the street. The man calls for help, and out comes a second, even more dazed-looking man. He is instructed to turn on the hose. He stumbles over to it and a light trickle of water comes from the mouth. "I need more line," says the first man. "There ain't any more line," responds the second, completely apathetic to their situation. Eventually, the volunteer fire department from the next town over arrives and promptly takes control of the situation. We decided it was time to leave. "I need more line" has become an inside joke among us.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.